So, ever actually stop and think about why the front room of your house is called a living room? I mean, it sounds totally normal to us today, right? But the bizarre historical truth here is that this term was literally a desperate rebrand by real estate developers and architects. They were basically trying to distance the American home from its super dark association with death parlors. And honestly, the story of how that all went down is absolutely wild. Let's get right into it. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving deep into the dramatic, kind of hidden history of how an entire industry managed to capitalize on a massive national tragedy. We'll look at how they took a deeply personal, hands-on family ritual and totally transformed it into a highly lucrative, multi-billion-dollar enterprise. This is the story of the hijacking of the American funeral. All right, part one, when death lived at home. Let's look at the reality of the 1850s. To really understand what changed, we've got to look at what used to be completely normal. Let's jump back to the 1850s. Back then, preparing a deceased family member right in your own parlor wasn't seen as morbid or weird at all. Honestly, it was just a standard Tuesday. For thousands of years, almost every culture handled their own dead the exact same way they handled their own births. It was entirely practical, and it was totally community-driven. Families just adapted to the seasons. Like in the summer heat, you had to move fast, packing blocks of ice around the body and draping vinegar-soaked cloths over the face just to mask the smell. But in the bitter winter, bodies might just wait out in an unheated outbuilding for weeks until the ground finally thawed enough to use a shovel. And this whole operation was managed by the women of the community. Literally the same women who delivered the babies. They used homemade wooden cooling boards and handled this super intimate process with bare hands and warm water. Moving on to Section 2, the Civil War catalyst, and how this whole system broke. The event that abruptly shattered this cultural norm wasn't some huge medical breakthrough, It was the American Civil War. That old family-run system worked perfectly fine right up until this exact moment in history. Roughly 620,000 soldiers died during the Civil War. I mean, just think about that number for a second. That is more American deaths than World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam combined. Suddenly, you've got massive numbers of young men dying hundreds of miles from home, left in the blistering summer heat of distant battlefields. The old system just completely broke down. Grieving families were desperate. They were writing these heartbreaking letters to the military, basically begging for their loved ones' bodies to be put on a train so they could be properly buried in the family plot. And of course, private entrepreneurs jumped right on this exact moment of desperation. Enter Dr. Thomas Holmes. He was a physician who figured out he could use arsenic-based chemicals to preserve bodies for that long train ride home. And just to be clear, he wasn't doing this as a public service for the army. He was a private businessman. He sets up these tents near the battlefields and starts charging grieving families $100 per body. To put that into perspective, that's about $3,000 in today's money. It was incredibly profitable. Then, cut to April of 1865, Abraham Lincoln is assassinated. His chemically embalmed, perfectly preserved corpse goes on this unprecedented 13-day train tour across the country. Millions of weeping Americans file past his open casket. And suddenly, seeing a body that just looked peacefully asleep became the new gold standard. In just a few short years, the entire American expectation of what death should look like had permanently shifted. Which brings us to Section 3, the rise of the funeral industry and corporatizing grief. So the war ends, and these battlefield embalmers flat out refuse to go back to being regular doctors or carpenters or chemists. Why? Because they had discovered something way more reliable than medicine. They realized that grief was an incredibly lucrative market. Families in their absolute worst, most vulnerable moments would pay basically anything to a professional who could make death look, well, less like death. But these guys had a massive PR problem. The title embalmer literally carried the stench of toxic arsenic and battlefield medical tents. So to sound a bit more respectable to high society Victorians, they started strategically rebranding step by step. First, they went with undertakers. But over time, that started sounding a little too gloomy and ominous, right? So they rebranded again, stepping it all the way up to the highly professional sounding funeral directors. And this brings us right back to that opening question. As these newly minted funeral directors moved out of pop-up tents and into nice, polished commercial spaces on Main Street, they started calling their businesses funeral parlors. But remember, the traditional American home also had a front parlor. That was literally the very room where families used to lay out the dead on cooling boards. Well, by the time the 1900s rolled around, families became so deeply uncomfortable sharing the name of a room in their own house with a commercial place run by strangers handling corpses that real estate developers had to step in. They literally invented the term living room just to completely erase that morbid association from the front room of the American home. Wild, right?
Hey, real quick, if learning the hidden, slightly morbid history behind everyday things fascinates you, make sure to drop a like on this explainer right now. Comment down below on what historical pivot has shocked you the most so far, and definitely hit that subscribe button so you never miss another deep dive explainer. Your support is seriously what helps us keep bringing these incredible stories to light.
Okay, getting back to the history. Through some fierce corporate lobbying, crazy upselling tactics, and a whole lot of fear-mongering about sanitation, the industry essentially monopolized death. They managed to convince the public that cheap homemade pine coffins were somehow undignified. Instead, you supposedly needed these hermetically sealed steel caskets and massive concrete vaults. And because of this completely artificial standard, the median cost of an American funeral just skyrocketed. You can see how it climbed from about $4,000 in the 1980s, pushed through $6,000 in the early 2000s, and then blew past a staggering $9,000 by 2020. They took a natural human process that used to cost the price of some local lumber and nails and successfully turned it into an expense that rivals buying a car.
Section 4. The true cost of death. We're talking financial, psychological, and environmental. The thing is, handing death over to strangers in black suits was never just a financial burden. By systematically removing our entire culture from the physical reality of death, we triggered a profound psychological and environmental toll on society. Think about a child in the 1850s. They actually had hands-on closure. They touched the cold skin of a grandparent. They smelled the damp soil on the fresh wood. They understood the finality of death on a really visceral level. Now compare that to a child a century later in the 1950s. They are completely alienated. They're told grandma's just sleeping while they stare at this sanitized, heavily made-up, wax-like figure resting inside a silk-lined box. We essentially built a modern society that is genuinely terrified and nauseated by dead bodies, all because we became completely disconnected from the process.
And modern science absolutely backs this up. Grief researchers and psychologists have actually found that families who physically care for their dead report a much higher sense of psychological completion. In fact, cultures that fiercely protect their traditional death practices, like the Jewish Shever Kadisha Burial Society or the Islamic Ghusl ritual washing, they actually experience significantly healthier psychological outcomes. This modern American model of the sanitized, outsourced, totally hands-off death, it's a complete historical outlier, and it is quietly leaving millions of people with unresolved trauma. And honestly, what's equally terrifying is what this industrial complex is doing to the earth. The environmental cost of the modern funeral industry is staggering. Every single year in the United States alone, we are needlessly pumping 800,000 gallons of highly toxic, carcinogenic embalming fluid, which is mostly formaldehyde, straight into the ground. We are cutting down and burying millions of board feet of pristine hardwood. We're dropping untold tons of steel in massive concrete vaults deep underground where they will just sit there indefinitely. It permanently disrupts the natural decomposition process and literally chokes the very earth we leave behind. So let's talk about part 5. Reclaiming the final goodbye, the modern counter-movement. Here is the good news, and why this all matters for us today. Things have been quietly shifting across the country. A growing number of families are looking at the crazy costs, the toxic chemicals, and that deep emotional alienation, and they're just firmly saying no to the industry. They're realizing that in the vast majority of U.S. states, home funerals are completely 100% legal. Enter the death doula. This is basically a modern echo of those women who handled community death care back in the 1800s. These trained practitioners aren't funeral directors. They aren't trying to upsell you on a mahogany casket. Instead, they gently guide and empower families to legally wash, dress, and mourn their loved ones right in the comfort of their own living rooms. They help navigate the complex legal paperwork and give families the space to process that raw emotional grief entirely on their own terms. And right alongside that home funeral movement is a really beautiful rapid rise of green burials. Conservation cemeteries are opening up all over the country. They allow bodies to be buried without any toxic embalming fluid, no massive concrete vaults, and no metal caskets. Instead, bodies are just wrapped in beautiful, breathable cotton or linen shrouds, or maybe placed in a simple, unfinished pine box, and returned naturally to the earth. It happens exactly the way human beings have done it for thousands of years, letting a vibrant wildflower meadow or thriving forest grow right over the exact spot where someone was laid to rest. Over the last century, we successfully outsourced the most profoundly human experience there is to commercial professionals. We basically traded our visceral, deeply necessary connection to the cycle of life for a sanitized, highly expensive illusion.
But as our society slowly begins to reclaim the courage to sit with grief and remembers that fundamental right to care for our own, we have to ask ourselves one really important question. When the time comes, who really owns our final goodbye?